You wake up and your joints already ache. Not from old age, from 31 years of grinding grain by hand, hauling water, sleeping on cold ground. Your teeth are worn flat, some already gone. Your back is bent from decades of stooped labor in the fields. And by the standards of the people around you, you are not young. You might already be considered old. There's no dentist. There's no painkiller stronger than willow bark. There's no way to set a broken bone that doesn't risk infection and death. There's no antibiotic if that infection takes hold. A cut on your hand from a flint blade could kill you in a week. So here's the real question this video is going to answer. How old did ancient humans actually get before they died? Not the number you've heard 100 times, the real one, the one hiding underneath it. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. That famous statistic, the one that gets repeated in classrooms and documentaries, ancient life expectancy was 30, is technically true and almost completely misleading. It's one of the most misunderstood numbers in human history. And once you understand why it's misleading, you understand something much deeper about how our ancestors actually lived and how differently they thought about age, death, and time itself. Let's start with the math nobody walks you through. Life expectancy at birth in prehistoric and ancient populations really was often in the 20s or 30s. That part is real. Researchers analyzing skeletal remains and comparative demographic models, including work by anthropologists like Rachel Kaspari, have shown these low averages again and again. But an average is not a lived experience, it's a statistic. And this particular statistic is being dragged down by something brutal: child mortality. In most ancient populations, somewhere between a third and half of all children died before the age of 15. Disease, malnutrition, childbirth complications, accidents, childhood was a gauntlet. And when you average a population where half the people die at age 2 and the other half die at age 65, you get a number, call it 33, that describes literally no one. Nobody in that population died at 33. It's a ghost number, a mathematical average that erases two very different life stories. Here's the deeper reframe. If you strip out childhood mortality and ask a different question, not how long did people live, but how long did people live if they survived to adulthood, the picture changes completely. A person who made it to 15 in ancient Rome had a reasonable shot at reaching their 50s or 60s. Skeletal evidence from sites across the ancient world regularly turns up individuals who lived well into old age, worn joints, healed fractures, evidence of decades more life after childhood ended. That's not a fluke. That's the actual shape of ancient mortality. Brutal at the start, survivable after that. And this is where it gets uncomfortable in a good way. Grandparents existed. Elders existed. Ancient societies had old people in them. People in their 60s, 70s, occasionally older, sitting by fires, passing down knowledge, running households, holding political and religious power. The image of a world without old age is wrong. What's true is a world where getting old was a filtered privilege, not a guarantee. So why does this matter? Because it changes how we should think about ancient wisdom, ancient leadership, ancient culture itself. Elders weren't rare anomalies. They were a functioning part of these societies, survivors of a brutal filtering process, yes, but present, respected, and often running the show. We don't know the exact numbers for most ancient populations, and we probably never will with full certainty. The skeletal record is incomplete, and different regions, classes, and eras varied enormously, but the broad pattern holds across an enormous range of evidence. And if you want to go back to the very root of this pattern, you have to go back further than agriculture, further than cities, further than written history. You have to go back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and further still, because some researchers argue this childhood mortality bottleneck, this brutal filter in the first years of life, may be older than our species itself. Evidence from Neanderthal remains shows the exact same pattern: catastrophic risk in early childhood, real survivability after it. Which means this isn't just a story about ancient humans. It might be a story about what it meant to be human, long before humans as we know them existed at all.
Let's talk about what actually killed people, because the causes tell you more than the ages do. Infectious disease was the single biggest force shaping ancient mortality. Not war, not famine, though those mattered too. Disease. Skeletal analysis from ancient burial sites shows this again and again. Bones marked by tuberculosis, teeth showing enamel defects from childhood illness and malnutrition working together. A 2015 study analyzing thousands of skeletons across multiple ancient populations found that infection and nutritional stress, not violence, were the dominant signatures left on ancient bodies. Here's the proof drop. Archaeologists studying ancient Egyptian mummies have found evidence of tuberculosis, parasitic infections, even atherosclerosis, hardened arteries, in bodies 3,000 years old, heart disease, in the pharaohs. The image of ancient people dying young, cleanly, of natural causes is a fiction. They were dying slowly of the same grinding conditions we associate with old age today, just arriving at those conditions on a very different timeline. Ancient bodies. War leaves dramatic evidence, a spear point lodged in a rib, a skull fracture, but it's rare compared to the quiet, invisible toll of disease. Chronic illness didn't wait for old age back then. It got there early, and it stayed. Now here's where it gets interesting. Childbirth. If you were a woman in the ancient world, your most dangerous years weren't childhood and weren't old age. They were your 20s and 30s, during your reproductive years. Maternal mortality was staggering by modern standards. Estimates for ancient and pre-modern societies suggest maternal death rates were roughly 1 to 1.5% per birth. And when you consider that a woman might give birth 6, 8, 10 times across her life, the cumulative risk stacks up fast. This is why ancient burial sites so often contain young women buried alongside infants. It wasn't rare, it was expected in the grim statistical sense. Historian and demographic researchers studying pre-industrial populations, including work built on the foundations of Thomas McCowan's demographic studies, have shown that maternal death was one of the largest single killers of adult women for most of human history, right up until the 20th century. Motherhood in the ancient world was closer to a battlefield than we like to admit. There's another angle to this that rarely comes up: violence and accident and how unevenly they hit different groups. Young adult men in many ancient societies showed disproportionately high rates of trauma in the skeletal record: healed fractures, blade wounds, blunt trauma, hunting accidents, tribal conflict, occupational injury from things like mining or construction. In some ancient populations, being a young man was statistically more dangerous than being elderly, which tells you something darkly funny about the whole system. Sometimes surviving childhood just meant graduating into a new category of ways to die. Let's talk about a specific and often overlooked mechanism: the weanling's dilemma. When ancient children stopped breastfeeding, usually somewhere between 2 and 4 years old, they lost the immune protection breast milk provided and were switched to solid food that was frequently contaminated, poorly stored, or nutritionally inadequate. Researchers studying skeletal growth patterns, including bioarchaeologist Mary Lewis, have identified this weaning window as one of the deadliest periods in an ancient child's life, visible directly in the bones, in growth arrest lines that mark exactly when malnutrition or illness struck hardest. You can literally read a child's worst year, written into their own skeleton, thousands of years later. That's the mechanism behind the number everyone misquotes. It's not that ancient adults were fragile and short-lived. It's that the first 5 years of life were a minefield, and the mortality statistics from that minefield get mathematically smeared across everyone's life expectancy, making 30-year-olds look like the norm when they were more often than not the survivors already halfway through a much longer story.
Let's tackle the biggest myth about ancient lifespan head-on: the idea that 50 was ancient and 60 was practically miraculous. It's not true, and the deeper mechanism behind why we believe it reveals something about how statistics get weaponized by simplicity. The mechanism is called survivorship framing. When you calculate life expectancy at birth, you are calculating the average age of death for everyone born, including the roughly 1 in 3 who never made it past childhood. But if you instead calculate life expectancy at 15, meaning given that you survived childhood, how much longer could you expect to live, the number jumps dramatically. Demographers working with historical population models, building on frameworks established by researchers like James Open and James Valpole, have shown this pattern holds across nearly every pre-modern society ever studied, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe to colonial-era populations. Here's the stat stack, because the numbers really do stop you cold. In ancient Rome, life expectancy at birth is often estimated around 25 to 30 years, but life expectancy at age 15, closer to an additional 35 to 40 years, meaning a healthy Roman teenager had a real shot at reaching their 50s or 60s. In some hunter-gatherer populations studied by anthropologists, once you hit age 45, your remaining life expectancy could add another 15 to 20 years on top of that. 3 very different numbers, 3 very different stories, all technically describing how long ancient people lived. That's not a small statistical footnote. That's the entire myth sitting inside one misread number. Now, the caveat, because this pattern wasn't universal, and pretending it was would be its own kind of lie. There are documented populations and eras where adult mortality really was catastrophic across the board, not just in childhood. Famine years, war-torn regions, the population collapses following certain plagues, where adult survivors themselves died in huge numbers regardless of age. The Black Death in the 14th century didn't discriminate the way ordinary disease did. It tore through adults in their prime as readily as it did children and the elderly, briefly erasing the normal survivorship pattern altogether for a generation. And there are individual outliers worth naming, because they complicate the tidy story too. The Roman senator and philosopher Cato the Elder reportedly lived into his mid-80s. Some ancient Egyptian priests, based on mummy analysis, appear to have lived into their 70s. These weren't statistical impossibilities. They were rare but real, proof that the ceiling on ancient human lifespan wasn't biologically that different from ours. What was different was how many people ever got the chance to test that ceiling. We don't know precisely how common these long lives were, and we probably never will. The further back you go, the thinner and more biased the evidence gets, skewed toward whoever happened to be buried somewhere archaeologists eventually found. But the pattern across everything we do have is consistent enough to trust. Ancient bodies could last. Ancient circumstances usually didn't let them. That's the myth cracked open. Ancient people weren't biologically doomed to die young. They were structurally exposed to early death, in a way modern people, for the most part, simply aren't anymore.
Here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part, because the honest ending of this story isn't ancient people had it worse and we fixed it. The honest ending is that we didn't eliminate the danger, we relocated it. The dramatic drop in child mortality that separates the ancient world from ours didn't happen through some slow accumulation of wisdom over millennia. It happened almost entirely in the last 150 years through sanitation, vaccination, antibiotics, and modern obstetric care. Researchers studying the history of public health, building on demographic transition theory, place almost the entire gain in human lifespan inside this narrow recent window. For nearly all of human history before that, the ancient pattern held: brutal childhood, survivable adulthood. Then, suddenly, in the span of a few generations, childhood stopped being a minefield for a huge portion of the world. But here's the uncomfortable through-line. That protection isn't evenly distributed today. In parts of the world without reliable access to clean water, vaccines, or maternal health care, child mortality rates still echo, faintly but unmistakably, the ancient pattern. The mechanism didn't disappear. It got fenced off, unevenly, behind infrastructure and wealth. Some of the 21st century still runs on ancient rules. And the modern industrial version of the mother's danger, the young man's danger, the invisible chronic disease danger, it didn't vanish either. It changed shape. Chronic disease still ends more lives than anything dramatic. Heart disease, the same condition found hardened into the arteries of 3,000-year-old mummies, remains one of the leading causes of death on the planet right now. We didn't defeat the ancient killers so much as trade acute versions of them for slow ones, spread out over more decades, dressed in modern packaging. Let's be honest about something else too. The elders who existed in ancient societies, the survivors who made it through childhood's gauntlet and childbirth's odds and young adulthood's violence, weren't just lucky. They were, in a very real sense, the filtered result of an entire population's risk. Every grandparent sitting by an ancient fire represented dozens of people from their own generation who never got the chance to sit there at all. Old age wasn't just achieved, it was survived, past a field of people who didn't. Which brings us back to where we started. Your aching joints, your worn teeth, your body already carrying the weight of decades of hard living by the time you're 30, that was never a sign of a short life cut off early. It was often just what a normal, ongoing life felt like, midway through. A body built for endurance rather than comfort, still years, sometimes decades from its actual end. The ancient world wasn't full of the young, it was full of survivors, who no longer thought of themselves that way. You are, statistically, the descendant of the ones who made it through.